A man in Berlin drops a cigarette into a trash can, and within seconds, the CIA has what they need to expose a high-level Soviet mole. What if the most ordinary object on a Cold War street corner wasn't what it seemed? Welcome to Cold War Berlin, where every park bench, manhole, and yes, even a trash can could be a surveillance device. In this story, we unravel how the CIA embedded a high-tech listening device inside a public trash can in East Berlin, and how it nearly collapsed an entire Soviet network from the inside. This is the story of how ordinary became extraordinary and deadly. Berlin in the 1960s and 70s wasn't just a city split by ideology. It was a city sliced down the middle by steel, silence, and suspicion, where every street lamp might hold a wire and every manhole cover might be rigged for sound, where West and East stared at each other across a concrete scar known as the Wall, and where the Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical standoff, but a daily grinding performance of subterfuge and surveillance. In this divided metropolis, spies didn't just lurk in alleys. They worked in embassies, sipped coffee in cafes, rented apartments above bakeries, and posed as journalists, clerks, students, even lovers, each feeding their respective masters information that might tip the delicate balance of fear. The Americans, through the CIA and National Security Agency, embedded antennas in rooftops and disguised listening posts in safe houses and churches, while the Soviets, through the KGB and the Stasi, wired entire buildings with microphones, bugged typewriters, and planted informants in schools and government offices, creating a city-wide ecosystem of secrets and betrayals. West Berlin was a glittering island of capitalism inside a gray sea of communism, and the East German secret police had made it their mission to monitor everything: phone calls, mail, footsteps, dreams, often turning family members into unknowing accomplices through routine interviews or friendly visits from party liaisons. Meanwhile, just across Checkpoint Charlie, American agents tried to stay 3 steps ahead, operating safe houses and dead drops, often unsure whether the person they had recruited was a genuine source or a cleverly placed double. The British, French, and even smaller NATO allies had their own agendas and assets, all threading through the divided city like a second, invisible Berlin overlaying the visible one. Underground cables crisscrossed the city, with fragile data and raw conversations captured from tapped lines, while rooftops bristled with satellite dishes and antennae pointed across zones like metallic flowers always in bloom. Whole floors of nondescript buildings were dedicated to listening, just listening, to what the other side might let slip, and banks of tape reels recorded thousands of hours of static, murmurs, and the occasional gold mine, a name, a plan, a meeting. In bars lit by neon, KGB officers clinked glasses with American informants, each pretending not to know the other's true identity. In the Tiergarten, briefcases were exchanged in choreographed encounters that seemed casual to the untrained eye, but were loaded with risk, each transaction a potential act of treason or triumph. Berliners, real Berliners, lived with all of this like background noise, aware but silent, complicit by necessity, survivors of a city whose heartbeat pulsed in code. And all the while, both East and West knew the real war was not just for territory, but for information. Who had it? Who could hear it? And who could trust? No one to keep it. By late 1973, a quiet panic had begun to stir within the CIA's Berlin station. Not the overt kind that triggered headlines or congressional hearings, but the slow, choking dread known only to those in the intelligence business when a trusted pipeline suddenly runs dry. For years, signals intelligence, SIGINT officers had relied on a network of cleverly placed wiretaps, rooftop antennas, compromised telephone exchanges, and decoy transmitters to monitor Soviet and East German communications across the divided city, sucking in reams of data that filled the magnetic tape reels, spinning in the shadows of listening rooms beneath embassies and consulates. These were the invisible arteries of espionage, pulsing with code names, delivery schedules, troop movements, and the steady heartbeat of paranoia. But now, those arteries were silent, and no one in Langley knew why. Phone lines that once buzzed with Soviet back-channel chatter went dead overnight. Shortwave broadcasts were abruptly truncated, and encrypted transmissions from KGB field operatives in East Berlin became erratic, fragmented or suspiciously perfect, as if deliberately staged for interception. Analysts initially blamed equipment failure, weather interference, or even bureaucratic error. But when backup lines failed, when triple redundant taps yielded only silence or benign gibberish, the truth became unavoidable. The Soviets had changed something fundamental, something strategic, and no one on the American side had seen it coming. Field officers began hearing whispers from informants, new encryption protocols, rotating frequencies, even low-tech tricks like moving conversations offline entirely, passing notes, using hand signals, or switching to analog landlines buried behind internal party walls. Some reports mentioned a Berlin Protocol, allegedly signed by a Politburo member and implemented through Stasi channels, a broad countermeasure against Western eavesdropping, plausible, perhaps, though not confirmed. What was certain was this: operations once considered reliable were now dangerously blind, and the silence was itself suspicious, suggesting not an absence of activity, but a suffocating control over it. Worst of all, the CIA didn't know how much had already been missed. Had an asset been flipped? Had a defection been preempted? Had a weapons transfer occurred under their noses? Director of Central Intelligence William Colby, during a closed-door meeting in late October, described Berlin as a black box with muffled screams. Information was going in, but not coming out, and any attempt to pry it open risked exposure. Urgency mounted to develop a new solution, one that could bypass traditional lines, one that could listen without wires, without contact, without leaving a trace. Something invisible, ordinary, and unnoticeable. And so, in the basement of the CIA station near Clay-Lee, a quiet directive was issued. Project Pilgrim would be launched, a multidisciplinary task force to explore passive surveillance methods beyond conventional wiretaps, solutions that could live in plain sight and hear everything without ever being suspected. The war for Berlin's secrets hadn't ended. It had merely gone deeper underground, and the CIA, already losing the edge in the auditory theater of Cold War espionage, knew it needed a miracle dressed as trash. Miles Granger wasn't the kind of man people remembered in photographs. Slightly stooped, prematurely balding, fond of second-hand trench coats and metal lunchboxes. But inside the CIA's Berlin station, buried beneath layers of redacted memos and jargon-drenched briefings, his mind worked like a locksmith, picking at the tumblers of Soviet secrecy, and it was during a rainy afternoon in February 1974, over lukewarm coffee and the muffled hum of static-filled reel-to-reel recordings, that he leaned back in his squeaky chair, stared out the window, and said something absurd. What if we bugged a trash can? The room, populated by a handful of SIGINT analysts and project leads frustrated by the drying well of Soviet intercepts, fell silent for a moment, then erupted in the usual cocktail of polite dismissal and bureaucratic groans. Granger, undeterred, opened a binder labeled Urban Acoustic Shell Concepts, flipped it past a rejected proposal involving sewer microphones, and sketched on a napkin the design for a device he called Quiet Lid, a parabolic microphone embedded beneath the rim of a standard municipal trash can, disguised as a weight plate beneath the lid, powered by a low-drain battery pack and triggered by directional audio thresholds. The logic, he explained, was maddeningly simple. Trash cans were everywhere, no one looked at them twice, and most importantly, they were serviced on a schedule, providing a predictable, deniable method to swap out recording components. He even had a target in mind: a Soviet diplomatic housing complex on Punkstrasse in East Berlin, frequented by mid-level attachés and military personnel who often smoked, gossiped, and conducted low-level business right outside its gates, usually beside a public trash bin near the entrance. After weeks of debate, several trial designs, and pushback from Langley over the optics of relying on a garbage can for state secrets, the project was grudgingly greenlit under the codename Operation Tin Ear, provided the device met three conditions. It had to be undetectable upon casual inspection, it had to record with clarity even in street-level noise, and it had to be replaceable during regular trash collection without raising suspicion. Granger, working with a small team of engineers and a contractor from the West German acoustic lab, Fichtner and Sohn, spent 6 weeks constructing a prototype inside a repurposed Berliner Stadtreinigung bin, complete with a hinged false bottom, noise cancellation mesh, and an early solid-state recorder wrapped in insulation to muffle impact noise from garbage. When the unit was field-tested near a Bundespost facility in West Berlin, it picked up conversations with enough fidelity to detect the crinkling of cigarette foil. The final breakthrough came when one field agent noted that the Soviets, due to internal regulations, emptied their trash using a contracted East Berlin crew, one that followed a rigid schedule and rarely checked bins beyond lifting and dumping, making it the perfect recurring access point. With quiet approval from the deputy chief of station and under the radar of nearly everyone else, the order was given. The trash can would go live next month, and if it worked, the CIA would prove that in the Cold War, sometimes the most valuable intelligence came from where no one dared to look. The engineering challenge wasn't just to make a bug that could hear secrets. It was to make one that could survive banana peels, cigarette butts, and Berlin's relentless winters without being noticed by a single Soviet janitor or street sweeper. And that's exactly what Miles Granger and his team set out to build in a rented garage near Spandau, where blueprints were sketched under flickering fluorescent lights and solder fumes hung in the air like incense at a Cold War chapel. The core of the device was a custom-built parabolic microphone, roughly the size of a saucer, designed to sit just beneath the inner rim of the trash can lid, calibrated to capture directional audio from within a 10-foot radius with uncanny clarity, especially voices pitched at conversation level. It was paired with a motion-triggered activation system, built from modified military surplus components that detected body heat and subtle vibrations, ensuring the recorder didn't waste tape on silence or car engines, only springing to life when someone stood nearby long enough to say something worth hearing. The real wizardry, though, was in power and storage. Since batteries couldn't be changed every few days without arousing suspicion, the team installed a slow-drain lithium thionyl chloride microcell, stabilized with German-designed resistors, that could run for nearly a month without recharge. For data capture, they used a miniature cassette system, skinged and repurposed from East German dictation equipment, modified with hardened casing and vibration-damping foam so it wouldn't skip or jam, even when trash was slammed inside the bin. Each tape could hold roughly 90 minutes of analog audio, recorded in tight magnetic bands that could later be run through CIA filter software to isolate human speech from ambient noise. But even the most advanced tech was useless if someone peeked inside, so the team built a false bottom, an internal plate crafted from aged aluminum to match the original interior, latched on a hinge system with a magnetic catch that sat flush with the interior curve of the can. On top of it, they arranged dummy trash, crumpled wrappers, broken pencils, half a stale sandwich encased in resin, all glued into place to maintain the illusion, even if the lid was lifted in passing. Finally, to sell the ruse completely, they introduced a series of scent dispersers hidden in a compartment along the base, loaded with synthetic odor cartridges that emitted the unmistakable bouquet of old coffee, spoiled milk, and burnt tobacco at timed intervals, giving any curious observer olfactory confirmation that this was indeed just another filthy Berlin trash can. Granger referred to it half-jokingly as the nose job, but its importance couldn't be overstated. No one would lean in for a closer look if their instincts screamed garbage. After weeks of testing and tweaks, running hot water over it to simulate rain, jostling it on cobblestones, even kicking it down a flight of stairs, the team finally had a surveillance device that was, for all intents and purposes, invisible, operational, and hiding in plain sight amid the city's cluttered streets, waiting to transform whispered gossip into geopolitical gold. On a damp Thursday night in April 1974, as the bells of St. Elizabeth's Church tolled softly across Berlin's Mitte district, Operation Tin Ear moved from theory into practice, and under a sky smeared with low-hanging clouds and sodium-orange street lamps, two CIA operatives dressed as East German municipal workers wheeled a battered trash bin down Punkstrasse, its rusted frame groaning softly with each bump in the cobbled sidewalk, while two additional agents stood watch from a bakery van parked nearby, posing as electricians waiting on a service call. Their target? The unassuming cylindrical bin stationed just 22 feet from the main pedestrian gate of a Soviet diplomatic housing block, a favorite spot for attachés and military liaisons to loiter, smoke, and mutter their grievances while waiting on evening rides or late-night companions. At 2:41 a.m., following a meticulously rehearsed drill, the team executed a swift swap. The original bin, identical in appearance, was lifted onto the dolly with a grunt, while the custom-bugged model, the culmination of 6 weeks clandestine engineering, was gently placed in its position, rotated precisely to match the wear marks on the pavement, and given a final nudge to anchor it over its concealed access panel in the sidewalk. No alarms sounded, no dogs barked, and no lights switched on in the building across the street, which loomed silent and unaware. By 2:49 a.m., the original bin was locked in the back of the van, already slated for disassembly and transport to a scrapyard outside the American sector. By the following morning, nothing seemed out of place. Except now, the trash can listened. The microphone beneath its lid sat primed for motion, its tiny tape reels ready to spin the moment someone lingered within range. And it wasn't long before they did. Within 48 hours, the first recording was captured. A cigarette break conversation between two uniformed men, one complaining bitterly about a delayed transfer, the other cursing the incompetence of the new boy from Odessa who couldn't encrypt a sandwich if you gave him mayonnaise. It was mundane, but it was proof the device worked, and over the next weeks, the trash can captured an expanding archive of voices, snippets of Russian, clipped German, boots scuffing concrete, lighters flicking open, names dropped casually that would later be cross-referenced by analysts back in Langley. To maintain the deception and preserve the data, the CIA devised a rotating crew posing as Berlin sanitation inspectors, complete with forged East German credentials and a maintenance van painted in the official livery of the Berliner Stadtreinigung. And each Friday at 3 a.m., they arrived under the guise of routine bin calibration, used a hidden tool to unlatch the magnetic catch beneath the false bottom, and swapped out the mini cassette tape with a fresh one, always in less than 5 minutes. The operation continued like clockwork, week after week, with surveillance teams posted nearby, sometimes from a florist's shop across the street, sometimes from the upper floor of a hollowed-out bookstore, logging who approached the bin, how long they stayed, and what patterns emerged. And thus, with no explosions, no gunshots, and no defectors, the CIA began listening to the Soviet bloc not through heroics, but through a trash can that never said a word, but heard everything. For the first several weeks after deployment, the reels coming out of the Pankstrasse trash can were almost insulting in their banality. Hours of wind-rattling paper, the dull thud of bottles dropping into metal, passing footsteps, laughter from distant bars, the occasional cough or muttered curse. And in Langley's listening rooms, analysts dutifully logged and cataloged the noise with growing frustration, wondering if Operation Tin Ear would end up as another clever idea that produced nothing but ambiance. Then, in late May 1974, during a routine overnight review, an analyst noticed something different buried beneath the static on tape 11B, recorded at 23:47 local time, a low, cautious exchange in Russian, barely above a whisper, two male voices standing close to the bin, their words softened by night air and traffic hiss, but unmistakably deliberate. The first voice asked a question, short and clipped, and the second responded with a string of numbers spoken slowly, as if to ensure accuracy, followed by a pause and the sound of a lighter snapping shut. The following week, another tape contained a similar exchange. Different voices, same cadence, numbers again. Then a brief phrase that translators flagged immediately as tradecraft shorthand rather than casual speech. By early June, a pattern emerged. The conversations always occurred between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., always involved 2 or 3 individuals lingering near the bin for less than 2 minutes, always included numeric sequences, and always ended with a coded confirmation phrase. The CIA's Berlin station forwarded the most promising excerpts to Langley, where counterintelligence specialists began cross-referencing the material against known Soviet operational methods. And it didn't take long for the hair on the backs of their necks to rise. One phrase, captured cleanly enough on tape 14C to be replayed again and again, froze the room. Pavlovich confirms from Odessa. To an untrained ear, it sounded meaningless, but to a senior analyst in the counterintelligence staff, it rang like a fire alarm. Pavlovich was a dormant codename that had surfaced twice before in unrelated intercepts tied to suspected leaks in American energy research programs, always without confirmation, always just out of reach. Odessa, meanwhile, wasn't just a city, It was a known Soviet relay hub for handling communications linked to scientific and industrial intelligence, especially anything touching nuclear development and advanced energy systems. Within hours, the phrase was escalated to a restricted briefing, and by morning, it sat on the desk of a deputy director at Langley, circled in red grease pencil. The implication was chilling. Someone with access to sensitive U.S. energy data might be feeding information through Soviet handlers operating in Berlin, using low-level street conversations as authentication points in a larger espionage chain. Suddenly, the trash can wasn't just eavesdropping on idle chatter. It was brushing against the edge of a mole hunt, one that could reach deep into the American bureaucracy. Analysts began tearing through personnel files, past investigations, half-forgotten suspicions, while Berlin Station was instructed to maintain absolute silence and continue operations unchanged. No deviations, no heightened presence, no sign that the whispers had been heard, because in the Cold War, the moment you revealed you were listening was often the moment everything went dark again. Within days of the Pavlovich confirms from Odessa recording, the quiet hum of Operation Tin Ear escalated into a coordinated continent-wide intelligence mobilization as Langley escalated the intercepted material to priority alpha status, triggering emergency consultations with allied services, internal mole hunts across multiple departments, and the deployment of nearly 50 CIA personnel from Frankfurt, Vienna, London, and Paris under temporary reassignment orders to Berlin. What had started as a creative surveillance experiment involving a disguised trash can had now become the center of a classified operation so compartmentalized it was referred to internally only by cryptonyms. No one outside the task force knew what Tin Ear actually was, only that it was yielding leads too hot to ignore. Analysts at Langley and in the Berlin station worked around the clock, mapping the whispered names, code phrases, and number sequences picked up by the trash can's microphone against known Soviet operational habits, constructing detailed matrices of possible connections between seemingly innocuous conversations and known espionage signatures. As the data deepened, a second shock came on tape 17A, amid a quiet argument in Russian about a failed drop. One voice hissed something that leapt out of the static and into history. Gregor Shalev no longer trusts the Odessa channel. The phrase triggered a flurry of alerts across CIA internal systems, because Gregor Shalev wasn't just a name. They had heard it once before, buried in an intercepted KGB communiqué during a failed defection case in Istanbul in 1971, where the name had been used in reference to a courier who delivered papers by foot, never by car, believed to be a code word for a human source. For years, Shalev had existed only as a shadow, a figure suspected of facilitating intel drops to the Soviets through Eastern European academic conferences and science exchanges, particularly those linked to nuclear research, but no hard proof had ever emerged, until now. With that name on tape, the Berlin team realized they had crossed a threshold, one where the trash can no longer just heard chatter. It was directly intercepting active spycraft in motion, and if Shalev was involved, there was reason to believe a mole was passing classified U.S. technical data through a Soviet backchannel routed via Berlin. However, just as the operation reached a new peak, an alert arrived from surveillance teams monitoring the area around Punkstrasse. An unfamiliar pair of men in Stasi overcoats had been spotted lingering near the trash can 2 nights in a row, and though they made no move to tamper with it, one had twice taken notes on a small pad while glancing toward the bin. Fearing compromise, the decision was made to relocate the device temporarily, swapping it in the dead of night for a replica bin with no bug while a new deployment site was prepped 3 blocks south near a tram. Stop frequented by the same Soviet personnel, the microphone remained silent for 12 days until tape 21B from the new location caught a new voice, female, whispering the word Shalev again, followed by a number, 82. Whatever was unfolding, it wasn't over. It was only now truly beginning. It ended, as so many intelligence operations do, not with a gunshot or a confession, but with a janitor holding a clipboard and a question. Why is this one always clean? The janitor, an older East German man with 30 years in building maintenance under the watchful eye of the Soviet diplomatic corps, had no official clearance beyond floor wax and boiler valves. But he had seen enough in his decades of quiet service to know when something didn't fit. And the trash can on Punkstrasse, the one just outside the gate of the Soviet residential complex, had become a riddle that he couldn't let go of. No matter how messy the evening's conversations, how many cigarette butts and sandwich wrappers were tossed in by diplomats and their aides, it never filled, never smelled, and when he did peek inside once, only once, he swore it looked too orderly. After filing a seemingly innocent facilities report, the can was flagged by a Soviet security attaché who ran it up the chain, eventually landing on the desk of a KGB field controller stationed in East Berlin, and within a week, a 5-man counter-surveillance team was quietly dispatched, not in uniforms, not in suits, but disguised as nighttime sanitation staff with forged city permits. They arrived just before dawn, during the scheduled cleaning rotation, and using magnetometers and a small radio frequency scanner hidden in a mop bucket, they spent less than 10 minutes examining the bin and discovered what the CIA had hoped would never be found: the telltale trace of a directional microphone coil and the faint signature of a transmitter embedded in the lid's inner lip. The trash can was loaded into the back of a covered truck without fanfare, replaced with a standard model, and driven to a secure KGB technical lab where it was dismantled piece by piece under floodlights and lead shielding, technicians photographing and cataloging every wire, circuit, and chemical compound. They found the false bottom, the scent dispersers, the camouflage cassette system, everything. And yet, the CIA had already won. Over 8 months of unbroken audio surveillance had captured names, numbers, patterns of behavior, procedural terms, linguistic quirks, and above all, operational rhythms, timings, drop language, fallback rendezvous points, all of which were now sitting in Langley, transcribed, decoded, and in some cases, already turned into action. A suspected courier in Rome had been quietly intercepted and deported under a customs violation pretext. A research attaché in Vienna had been denied visa renewal without explanation. And a series of late-night transfers through Prague had suddenly gone silent. Even the mysterious Gregor Shalev, who remained a ghost in the wind, now had a voice print, a gait profile, and a likely regional accent. The KGB, furious and humiliated, launched an internal investigation that led to several quiet purges and the rewriting of communications, protocol manuals across the Warsaw Pact. In Berlin, the CIA mourned the loss of the device, but not the data, because the trash can had done its job, and in a war where information was the deadliest weapon, it had bled the enemy dry before they even knew they'd been wounded. In the weeks following the discovery of the CIA's trash can bug, fallout rippled across the covert world like cracks in ice under a boot heel, silent, sudden, and irreversible. And while the Soviet press wasted no time mocking the find with biting headlines like "American paranoia reaches the pavement" and "CIA thinks litter talks," behind closed doors in Moscow and East Berlin, the mood was anything but amused. The recordings pulled from Operation Tin Ear had already been analyzed, tagged, and shared with vetted NATO intelligence units. And within days, 3 Soviet handlers operating under diplomatic cover were identified by voice print and behavioral pattern. One posing as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy in Bonn, another stationed in Prague under the Ministry of Agriculture, and the third, a ghost of a man, linked to a forged Hungarian passport and photographed only once during a chance tale in Brussels. While the KGB scrambled to reposition and recall these operatives under layers of denial and misdirection, Langley focused inward, using transcripts from the trash can tapes to revisit long-dormant files of personnel flagged over the years for anomalous access behaviors. 2 names surfaced quickly: mid-level American analysts whose internal movements had previously raised mild suspicion, but had never triggered full investigations, both of whom appeared in conversations captured outside the Punkstrasse housing block, referenced obliquely but undeniably in context with project code names and payment queues. One, a civilian contractor with the Department of Energy's Satellite Reconnaissance Division, was quietly reassigned to a non-classified logistics role in a Western outpost and placed under surveillance. The other, a State Department linguistics liaison with deep clearance and frequent travel privileges, was arrested during a routine exit interview after a trip to Geneva, his luggage found to contain unregistered microfilm capsules and a pocket calendar with several dates matching those logged from the trash can operation. His name was never released to the press, his arrest handled so delicately that not even his family knew the true nature of the charges, but his case would later serve as a quiet warning in security briefings. Remember Geneva? Don't be Geneva? Meanwhile, in East Berlin, the implications of the breach forced a painful reckoning inside Soviet intelligence circles, where the once reliable protocol of casual street exchanges, an elegant, near untraceable method of authenticating and relaying intel, was now deemed compromised. A full overhaul of Berlin's communications structure was ordered, leading to a temporary suspension of all foot-based message transfers, a purge of compromised couriers, and the rapid introduction of newer, more encrypted short-range transmitters designed to replace human verbal links. Internal memos from the Soviet 7th Directorate, later declassified, revealed panic over just how long the trash can had been active and how much it might have heard. Suggestions were even made that the janitor who had discovered the bug might himself have been a CIA plant, a suspicion so absurd it was never pursued, but one that illustrated how deep the paranoia now ran. In the end, though the Soviets laughed in public, the joke had cost them dearly, and the silence that followed was not relief, but recalibration. Today, it sits under glass at the CIA Museum in Langley, Virginia. Unremarkable at first glance, just a dented, charcoal gray trash can with peeling paint and a faint stain along one side, a relic of a city that no longer exists in the form it once did. Yet those who understand its history know that this silent, unassuming object was once one of the most successful passive intelligence gathering tools the agency ever deployed during the Cold War, known officially as Artifact Number 743 and unofficially as the Can That Listened. It represents a rare triumph of patience, design, and audacity. A surveillance operation so elegantly constructed, so well executed, and so quietly devastating that even after it was discovered and ridiculed by Soviet state media, the damage it inflicted on Eastern Bloc networks could not be undone. Its success wasn't in how flashy it looked or in some miraculous technological leap, but in its invisibility. Hidden in plain sight on a Berlin sidewalk, humming softly, while Soviet operatives whispered next to it, believing they were safe in the noise of the city. For over 8 months, it did what satellite cameras and informants couldn't. It listened without blinking, without resting, without betraying itself, capturing the rhythms of espionage in their rawest form. Late-night code exchanges, names muttered under breath, curses at failed drops, and the calm professionalism of handlers who thought they were alone in the dark. That the KGB found it eventually only confirmed its impact, for, had it truly been useless, they wouldn't have overhauled an entire communications infrastructure in response, wouldn't have burned a dozen routes, recalled diplomats, and revised training manuals to avoid future exposures. In its wake, American counterintelligence confirmed 3 foreign handlers, unraveled a quiet mole hunt that led to multiple internal arrests, and proved the viability of passive, location-fixed audio surveillance in high-density diplomatic zones, a tactic now common in modern intelligence circles, but at the time considered experimental and, by some, even laughable. More than anything, though, the trash can has come to symbolize the paranoia and brilliance of Cold War espionage, the constant battle for inches of information, the belief that danger could come from the sky, a smile, or in this case, a municipal waste receptacle. Museum placards tell visitors the basic facts. Deployed in Berlin, 1974, operation name Tin Ear, recovered by Soviet counter-surveillance. But they cannot convey the breathless thrill when analysts first heard the phrase, Pavlovich confirms from Odessa, nor the quiet high-fives exchanged when a whispered name matched a file in Langley's archives, nor the disbelief when they realized that all of it, every tape, every word, had come from garbage. In the Cold War, the battlefield was the ordinary world twisted into something secret and strange, where nothing could be trusted. And nothing was what it seemed, not even a trash can, not even silence, and certainly not the thin veil between a public street corner and the deepest vaults of state secrets. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more true Cold War tales of espionage, deception, and the invisible war fought in plain sight. Got a favorite spy gadget or operation you want us to cover next? Drop it in the comments below. In a world where even trash cans could be listening, you never know what we'll uncover next.